All right, joining us now is criminal defense attorney Lara Yeretsian, and I want to point out that Lara was part of a very famous case that has parallels to this one. Lara was involved with the defense team in the Scott Peterson case, and there are some similarities. Scott Peterson was convicted in the murder and death of his pregnant wife, Lacey, who disappeared just before Christmas in 2002. While his wife was missing, he engaged in an affair. He was also believed to be the last person to see his wife Lacey alive, though in that case, her body was found about 3 months after she went missing. Peterson was ultimately found guilty and is now spending the rest of his life in prison pending a number of appeals. But Lara, thank you very much for joining us today. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So as I said, there are some similarities. The first one being that, in fact, he was the spouse. And I think that's pretty regular in these types of cases, in that police first turn their eyes towards the spouse in any kind of murder case involving someone. And I think that sometimes can lead to problems because once they train their eyes on someone, sometimes it kind of blinds them to some of the other things that might be going on. Has that been your experience?
Definitely. Again, the police generally, when a spouse passes away or is missing or disappears, they'll start focusing on the other spouse. And that spouse is put under a microscope. Every little thing that that spouse does becomes an issue and they just zoom in on it and they make it bigger than what it is. And yes, they do ignore other things that could have led to this individual being missing or disappearing or dying or whatever it may be. And that was the case in the Peterson case. And here I see, again, just like they did with Peterson, they're doing it here. They're really zooming in on the reaction and how the defendant in this case was responding to his wife disappearing. Was he joining with the searches? He was or he wasn't? Was he ignoring it? What was he saying? And in Peterson's case, he was actually joining with the searches. But despite that, they still zoomed in on him. And every little thing he did, if he smiled, it was a big deal. Oh, see, he just never cared about her. Here, too, the fact that he didn't join and he just had basically, because of the kind of personality he's got, he's not very talkative. He seems to be an introvert. That's being used against him. So no matter what the spouse does, it doesn't matter what he or she does. They will be the prime suspect and everyone will focus on them. And that's what law enforcement does, unfortunately, in every single case. I understand they should be the first suspect, but you can't ignore other facts in the case.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, and what you're talking about is confirmation bias, right? So suddenly everything, if you have this theory that they're responsible for the disappearance, suddenly everything they do begins to look like it fits that narrative, right? So if he's just the kind of guy, and we've heard tons of testimony, we've even had it elicited on cross-examination by the defense that he was just a quiet guy, right? So now suddenly his being quiet can be interpreted as being someone who doesn't care.
Correct, and it could lead to a jury thinking, wait a minute, he's guilty. Why is he being quiet? And if you notice, every single witness who was testifying, everyone felt that, my goodness, this was not the typical reaction that we've seen. But you know, many of these people don't even know this man. They have no idea how he would react to this kind of a situation, to the disappearance of his wife, a wife who's had issues that he's been dealing with for years, a wife who's tried to commit suicide at least twice, and a third time seems like it was accidental. A wife who has said that next time you're not going to find my body. I mean, this man has been through a lot, and it sounded like from some of the employees or colleagues of his, people who've worked with him, it sounded like he's a very hardworking man and the quiet type. That's just the way he is. His demeanor, from what I recall, one of the witnesses, in fact, said, his demeanor has never changed. It's always been the same, no matter what happens. So why are we expecting anything different now? Why is it that we're making such a big deal? Why is it that we expect him to react the way we would have? Every single individual is different, and that should not be used against a defendant. But you know what? That's a huge chunk of this prosecution case.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting, as you say that, he was in a no-win situation, right? Because if his demeanor does change, right? If it doesn't change the way they want it to change, then the change would be used against him. Oh, he changed in some way. And suddenly that is evidence of the fact that he might be guilty. So it's a difficult situation. I want to quickly play a soundbite here from one of his colleagues. You mentioned his colleagues in some of the testimony. This particular one was a supervisor of his, and he's going to talk a little bit about how the defendant had access to an area where he might have been able to get rid of the body. Let's take a listen.
And at that time, have you used the verbiage that he had decision rights?
Yes.
And so what do you mean by that? Just kind of what you've explained? He was the one deciding?
He would make the decision of, what material they would haul at what period of time of the day.
Okay. And then that would go over to the landfill cells?
Yes.
At the time, you've referred to the fact that out at the landfill was this padlock. You indicated there were keys to open it. Is that right?
Yes.
And who would have access to those keys then?
The McKeefrey personnel. But typically it would be the landfill operator that would have ownership of that key.
And if Curley had told law enforcement he had access to the keys, that would make sense?
Yes.
Now, you indicated there were no cameras out at the landfill. There was no formal check-in system. There wasn't really a security system out there either at that time, was there?
That's correct.
All right, now, Lara, this witness is where I felt the prosecution's case started to pick up a little steam, because we had heard a lot of testimony about what we're talking about here, about his demeanor, about all the searches that took place. And so that hit harder when I heard this, where they're trying to say, okay, all the searches everywhere for this sickly woman, they couldn't find her, but yet he had access to a place where he could have gotten rid of the body without a trace. So I thought it started to pick up a little steam there.
I can understand why. Obviously, now they're trying to say, see, he had a place to hide the body. That's why we couldn't find the body. And this is one place where if the body's dumped, from what I understand, it's almost impossible to find it. So yeah, that's not a good fact, the fact that he had access. But what does it mean to have access? Does that mean that he had the keys to this place? Does that mean that he could have gotten in unnoticed? I mean, are there others going to this location? How easy is it for him to get away with going in, dumping a body, and not walk away unnoticed? Those are questions that I'm sure a jury is going to want to know. It's not enough to just have access.
Lara, let me stop you there and give you 3 answers that came across on his direct examination. Yes, he had access to keys. He went at night, and at night the place was closed because they didn't want to work after dark. And he had time to do it during that time, of course, in the middle of the night, where apparently the time that this event or incident would have happened. So all 3 of those are answered in a way that's not favorable to the defendant.
Not the best fact, and not the best witness for the defense. I can tell you that's pretty obvious. But is that enough to convict a man? Just saying that he had access to a place where he could have dumped the body. It shouldn't be.
I'm not sure, but we got to wait for the rest of their case. But I want to talk a little bit more about what's coming up as well with you. We'll break this all down and figure out if the prosecution can meet their burden in this case. So stand right by, please. We're going to take a break. Now, in the days, weeks, and months after the victim in this case, Lara Prokopovitz, went missing, law enforcement and volunteers searched extensively for her. But the defendant didn't help and even made some troubling comments about that search and how it might all turn out. So we'll look at how that plays into this case coming up. Stay with us here on Court TV.
It was just me and my mom. We weren't making ends meet